there are these legalistic definitions, and we need to keep in mind that these are all relatively recent, roughly about 100 years ago when people started in the developed West, when there was concern with war, how to prevent it, how to prevent the carnage that's associated with war, and so on. If you look historically at wars, whether in Europe, Asia, Africa, North America, or South America, then what we consider to be war crimes today was essentially the modus operandi of most armies in the past. Look at ancient texts, look at the wars fought by the Greeks against the Persians against the Greeks, Alexander the Great against the entire world, the Romans, the Gauls. Everybody was committing what we would today consider to be war crimes. Look at the 30 Years' War in Europe. Good Lord, the whole thing was a war crime from the beginning till the end. And of course, so in that sense, the term it's useful. It's useful because it labels something as something very bad. But we need to appreciate that it's, again, a relatively recent invention, if you like, and that in reality, if we simply look at atrocities committed against civilians, and especially unnecessary atrocities committed against civilians, then we need to come to the conclusion, the very sad conclusion, that this is essentially the way human beings have been fighting one another for millennia. So that puts things in a certain perspective. That said, if one looks at the relationship between Ukraine and Russia historically as well, and not just within the last, say, 50 to 100 years, then in many respects, that relationship is one that is best characterized as war crimes. That is to say, the Russians or the Muscovites, call them whatever you like. They have repeatedly, consistently, historically been committing the equivalent of atrocities, massacres, and indeed war crimes. We know those that were committed. We know most about those that were committed within the last 50 to 100 years because there is a more substantive historical record. But, in fact, it's nothing new. By the way, the Russian attitudes and behaviors towards other peoples in the Russian Empire or in the Soviet Union is probably no less criminal. The expansion into Siberia in the 15th, 16th centuries essentially entailed the extermination of large numbers of native populations. The Russian expansion into Central Asia in the 19th century into the North Caucasus, again, entailed genocides, war crimes, massacres, atrocities of all kinds. So there is a consistency in Russian behavior. Unfortunately, as I was suggesting at the very beginning, there's also a consistency in human behavior. So British policies towards native peoples in their colonies, French policies towards native people in their colonies, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, and so on, weren't necessarily all that better than that of the Russians. And then, of course, let's keep in mind that the various native populations were continually committing the equivalent of war crimes as well. The ancient Aztecs, the Incas, built their empires on the bones of their enemies, and so on and so forth. Yes, that's already going beyond the norm, so to speak. We're used to seeing war crimes committed during wars, and one could say that about every war, just about. And then there is a certain sense of, then there's a certain boundary that even war criminals can exceed. And again, mass rapes, unfortunately, have been committed in history, but to commit rapes of children to commit rapes of women while their loved ones are forced to watch, that's the stuff of Hollywood horror movies. And that's already excessive even for criminals. And the fact that the Russians are doing this on a systematic basis, the fact that they really aren't doing much of anything to hide that either. There was that one instance of this Russian who was, at best, mistreating, arguably raping a child, an infant, and he posts the video of his deeds and sends them out to his friends. That's clearly beyond the norm. Even the norm is outrageous. Even the norm deserves the severest condemnation. But when you engage in this kind of behavior, then all one can do is just kind of grasp at one's head, at one's hair, and say, I don't understand how people can behave this way. Well, I think, there are, two potential answers to this. The more straightforward one is this. It's been the Russian ideology that's been promulgated by the Putin regime for the last 20 odd years is an ideology that essentially denies the humanness of Ukrainians. You could call it a racist ideology, a supremacist ideology, imperialist. Call it whatever you like. But not only does it deny the existence of Ukrainians, but it denies the humanness of Ukrainians. They are not people. They are not agents. They are things. They are obstacles to Russia's glory, to Russia's identity. And we know that the regime has been pushing this line, well, certainly for the last 20 years. We know that prominent individuals within the Russian political and ideological elites have been pushing this line. Indeed, to some degree, the Russian Orthodox Church has been pushing this line as well. And of course, this isn't completely new. It has its roots in Soviet ideology, has its roots in Russian imperial ideology going back to at least the 19th century, if not earlier. So if Ukrainians don't exist, or if they're all Nazis, which is to say they're all fundamentally evil, then there's nothing wrong with humiliating, destroying, wantonly torturing these individuals because A, they don't exist, and B, if they do exist, they deserve it anyway. So I think a lot of the atrocities that we're seeing have to do with the fact that the mindset of the soldiers, the mindset of the officers is such as essentially to deny the humanity of Ukrainians. What do you do to vermin? Well, you stamp them out. What do you do to cockroaches? You destroy them. What do you do to Ukrainians? Well, why not destroy them as well? It's essentially, it's very reminiscent. Indeed, it's identical to the ideology promulgated by Adolf Hitler vis-a-vis Jews, Gypsies, Roma, and Slavs. These are essentially Untermenschen, subhumans of one kind or other. The other factor, which is a little more complicated, but again, it's been reflected in other historical cases, is that there's a kind of progressive brutalization. There was a fascinating interview with a woman who survived Bucha. And she says that initially the soldiers came and they were actually friendly. They thought that they would be welcomed. They weren't. They thought they would be honored and glorified. They weren't. And quite the opposite, they were perceived as enemies at worst and as intruders at best. And then over time, in the course of a couple of days, in the course of a few weeks, they turned angry, angrier. They got frustrated. They weren't being fed. They didn't know why they were there. They were losing faith in themselves and whatever cause that they thought they had. And the anger began to turn into frustration, into violence. And what initially you had soldiers who were, more or less normal. And within a week or two, they had turned to savagery. They started killing, they started raping wantonly, more or less randomly, as a kind of, as an expression of their anger, their frustration, and partly, of course, of the ideology that had permeated them. So you have these two explanations. They're not competing, they're perfectly consistent. One is that you have a certain mindset that turns you, that inclines you to think of Ukrainians as subhumans. And two is the frustrations of being on the front, seeing failure, seeing and feeling anger. And then, of course, whom do you blame for the anger? Whom do you blame for the frustrations? Well, it would be too easy to say that they should blame Putin. Of course, they should. But in reality, of course, they blame the people who are most vulnerable and who happen to be living in the neighborhood, namely the people of Bucha. There's a third, it just occurs to me, there's actually a third explanation, which again is consistent with the first two. And that is the long record of atrocities committed by the Soviet and the Russian armies. There were atrocities in the Chechen wars. There were atrocities committed in Afghanistan. There were atrocities committed in Western Ukraine in 1941, in Katyn Forest against Polish officers, during World War I. And of course, we talked about earlier atrocities committed against Ukrainians during the Mazepa period, during the Khmelnytsky period, and so on. So one could make the case that irrespective of whatever mindset that Putin and his cronies have been propagating over the last few decades, there is a deeper kind of problem with Russian political culture. And I think that's true too. Again, I'm not exactly sure how to grasp it because culture is such a fuzzy notion. But there's clearly a problem with Russian political culture. And again, it's most clearly manifested in particular examples. So I spoke of that soldier who films himself raping a child. There's that instance of a young girl, we're not sure of how old she was, but let's assume she's 10-ish or thereabouts, whose body was found in a morgue in Kiev, and it had the remnants of 20 different variants of sperm. So she was gang raped by 20 guys. I mean, how does one wrap one's head around that? And that's on the front. And then you've got the case of the Russian eparchy in Bryansk, which publishes a holy picture with a picture of a saint on one side and an injunction to Russian soldiers on the other side that their task, their obligation, is to erase the Ukrainian nation, and I'm quoting, to erase the Ukrainian nation from the face of the earth, end of quote. Patriarch Kirill has also been using has also made a variety of very incendiary statements, essentially arguing that Russians should just go out and kill. So that obviously goes hand in hand with Putin's ideology, but it also suggests that there's something terribly, terribly wrong with Russian culture, with Russian political culture, because it's just so widespread. We're not only talking about individuals anymore, there seems to be a systemic problem here. There's the case of the woman who, in a telephone conversation overheard by the Ukrainian Secret Service, tells her husband, and I quote, "Go for it. rape those Ukrainian broads. The only important thing is wear protection, end of quote. That's just, again, I don't know how to explain that. That's not just Putin's ideology anymore. That's a deeper Russian problem. And it's a problem that they have to deal with. Just as the Germans had to deal with the problems with German culture that made Nazism possible, so too the Russians will have to deal with whatever it is, whatever component of their culture that has made these atrocities possible so many times in their own history. And it's not enough anymore to say, well, this was in response to an aggression by the Mongols or the Nazis, because there was no aggression here. There was no response. This was a willful attack. This was a willful war, and this was a willful, intentional genocide compounded with a whole series of war crimes committed throughout all of Ukraine. In general, people don't talk willingly or gladly about the awfulness that they've experienced. That was certainly true in the case of World War I, where veterans, whether Germans, British, French, or Americans, came home and they experienced what we would call, post-traumatic stress syndrome. They were unwilling to talk about their experiences. They tended to be reticent. People asked them, they said, well, we'll talk about it some other time. And again, it was a defense mechanism. They had seen and experienced and done awful things that they wanted to forget rather than to revive. The same was true of World War II. The same was true of the Vietnam War. I mean, the veterans that came back to this country generally didn't want to talk about what they had seen, done, or experienced. And it's only within the last several decades. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't really speak with any authority about this, but it seems to me that it's only within the last several decades that, the profession and more generally societies have come around to the view that rather than not talking about things that were experienced, one should talk about things that were experienced in order to get them out and then in order to deal with them in some fashion. And if you look at the atrocities experienced by Ukrainians, we'll take the Holodomor. For decades, the only real survivor testimonies were collected in those two books, The Black Deeds of the Kremlin, and many of those were done anonymously, so we didn't really know who these people were. And they were anonymous because they were fearful of KGB retaliation. They were, there are a variety of things that played a role here. But part of the problem was that people just didn't want to talk about their experiences. They were too terrible. The same was true of World War II, especially of the massacres perpetrated by the NKVD in Western Ukraine in the summer of 1941. They literally filled the prisons and jails of Western Ukraine with corpses in the course of several days, 5, 6, 7 days, something like 23,000 Ukrainian, mostly Ukrainian, but also some Polish and Jewish political prisoners were literally slaughtered. Very often they were mutilated, they were tortured, and very often they appear to have been mutilated after having been killed. So one of my uncles, by the way, was a victim of this, and apparently when his corpse was found, his tongue had been cut out before he had been killed. And there were instances of pregnant women whose bellies were ripped open. All these terrible, terrible things. And again, some people wrote about this, but as a rule, that was not something that you wanted to talk about. As you probably know, Ksenia Kibuzinski and I, she's the Slavics librarian at the University of Toronto, we compiled a collection of documents dealing with those massacres. And there were many, but it's certainly not the kind of thing that people generally talk about in, let's call it, polite company. When I certainly never experienced that when I was in the presence of my parents, and I used to ask them all sorts of questions about what they had experienced, and they would usually just kind of prefer not to talk about it. And the same was generally true of other Ukrainians that I spoke with over the last few decades. But as I said, recently, the importance of remembering, the importance of healing, the importance of closure, it's become more evident within the larger Canadian or American context. And that, of course, opens up the door for Ukrainians to start remembering as well and putting their voices either into print or in documentary form. As you know, there have been a number of documentary films dealing with a variety of issues in Ukrainian history. So increasingly, people will talk about this. And I think today, and certainly in the foreseeable future, we're going to have far more written as well as video, as well as documentary evidence of the war crimes that people experienced in the current war. If only because, the Ukrainian government is noting this down. Foreign journalists are keeping tabs. You're keeping tabs. I'm keeping tabs. This is no longer a secret. And I think people will be talking very openly about this. But they already are. That's certainly my impression. The government is compiling lists of reported war crimes. The local populations are encouraged to keep tabs as well. Ukrainian legal experts have already turned to The Hague as well as to the International Criminal Court. A number of Western countries have initiated war crimes investigations, as has the International Criminal Court. Putin has been called a war criminal. He's been accused of committing genocide officially, openly by the United States. I don't see that there's much that can be done at this point in order to accelerate or improve the process. Essentially, a number of countries are already on board. They're already pursuing these legal measures. The documentation is there. I saw recently, I forget exactly where, but it was on some Ukrainian site, that the Ukrainian journalists are taping Russian television programs. Again, incendiary television programs, and the point of this is to accumulate evidence for potential war crimes trials in the future. So everything is being done, from documenting atrocities at the low level, such as in Bucha, to documenting every speech, every statement made by Putin, Medvedev, and their other accomplices, along with a variety of legal measures. The ducks are all in a row. It's now really a question of the war ending. And more importantly, it's a question of the war ending on Ukrainian terms. If, heaven forbid, Russia wins, then, there will still be a variety of punitive measures, but the enthusiasm will perhaps subside a bit. But if Ukraine wins, and I think they will, then, the momentum, as it were, will be on our side, and we're likely to see war crimes trials, presumably in absentia. But all these individuals within Russia, the top 10, 15, 20 individuals have been responsible for policy with respect to the war. They will at some point be sitting in The Hague, literally or at least figuratively. The atrocities, the war crimes, the long record of war crimes and atrocities committed by Russia, the problematic nature of Russian political culture, all these things that we've talked about, they will lead, I'm sure, to two very important reevaluations historiographically. One thing is they will force people who are Russia specialists, Russianists, whether in history, political science, culture, language, literature, to rethink what Russia means and what Russian culture entails. There is no way that one can avoid the question of how is it possible that this supposedly great culture, the culture of Tolstoy and so on? How is it possible that this supposedly great culture has consistently behaved in a Nazi manner? Right? One could pretend these were issues that only Ukrainians and other people raised in the past, but nowadays that's no longer possible. How is it possible that what seems to be the vast majority of Russians support Putin and his criminal war? How is it possible that these things have happened? And as I've been suggesting before, something is deeply, terribly wrong with Russian culture. And again, these are now issues that Russianists will have to address. By the same token, this will also have an impact on how Ukrainian resistance to Russia will be studied. The standard argument that we've been making is that, well, we needed to employ violence because we were dealing with a very violent criminal regime, whether in the First World War, the Second World War, or today. That's persuaded some people. And of course, as you know, that's also not persuaded others who believe that the Ukrainians are intrinsically violent, terrible fascists, and all these other sorts of things. That particular view no longer rings true. Because now we know that our insistence in the past that the NKVD, the KGB, the Cheka, Lenin, Stalin were terrible people doing terrible things to a largely innocent nation, and of course are still doing terrible things to a very innocent nation today. All of that will force a reevaluation and will lead, I think, to a reevaluation of the OUN, the UPA, Petlura, and many other actors. It will be harder to claim that they're villains. Of course, some people will always claim that, but it will be very hard to claim that they're villains in light of what is currently taking place. A genocide, one of a number that the Russians have committed vis-a-vis Ukraine. And it begins to make more sense that, the only way to respond to a genocidal regime is unfortunately by means of armed resistance. There is unfortunately no other way, as we know from history, both Ukrainian history as well as the history of other peoples who've been the victims of genocide. Okay, take care. Good luck. Slava Ukraini.